In this video, we'll be breaking down how to scale creatives on Meta ads without fatigue. We'll be separating this video into 3 different sections. Number 1 is breaking down the fundamentals that you need to understand to be able to scale creatives on Meta. Number 2 is the creative angles and concepts that actually work and do scale. And then lastly, we'll be going into individual media buying tactics that you can use in your account right now to take an ad that's performing well, but it's not getting enough spend that you would like, and actually get incremental spend in there that's profitable. So starting off with fundamentals, we do have another video on this, but it is an important concept to understand before we start layering in creative angles and individual media buying tactics. The fundamental that you need to understand about Meta is that each ad can be viewed as an individual unit. And so each of these are ads that are going into the account. Now, there is a percentage hit rate on how many ads will actually perform well, and you'll be able to run for an extended period of time and get incremental spend into the ad that's going to be profitable. Now, the reality is that most ads that get launched don't work. And so you have a high percentage of these ads that don't work, and then one of the ads actually does. As you go and look to scale that creative up, and if we put time on the x-axis here, and we put spend on the y-axis, you'll end up launching it, you'll put more spend into it, and then you'll find a point of diminishing returns in which you'll need to pull back spend, hold there for a while, and then eventually the creative will fatigue and come down to 0. And then the area under the graph here is the total spend that you're able to actually get through that ad over its lifetime. And this is how you should be approaching an ad account. And from here, you can obviously draw a lot of conclusions, which is number 1, we should be looking at how can we get our hit rate up? Number 2, how can we get our volume up? And then number 3, how can we make this curve not decline as sharply so that we can actually keep ads running for longer to be able to maximize the spend that we can get into these high performers once we find them. So let's say you find a high performer and you're in this position where it's starting to fall off and it's declining. Why is it declining? Why can't you get it to spend $20,000, $30,000 and these ads start to fatigue at $2,000, $3,000? Well, it depends on how wide the target demographic is that you're going after within that particular creative angle. And so the creative angle ends up becoming a really important component of how scalable an ad is. And I'll give you a really specific example of this. If I was to make an ad, and we're going to branch out of ecom for a second because this becomes a really easy example. If I was to make an ad that has a hook and the entire angle is targeted at ecom CFOs that their businesses are doing over $100 million a year, versus I have an ad that's targeting ecom founders where their business is doing over $1 million a year, this is a considerably larger target demographic. In fact, it's probably 1,000 to 2,000x the size. And so when I go and have a creative like this, I can reach a lot more of the very specific target demographic that I'm actually calling out in that ad. And therefore, I can likely get longer sustained spend through a unique ad that's actually cutting through to that target demographic. Vice versa, if I have a creative that's targeted at this audience, I'm not going to get the duration or the total net spend that I want through that individual ad because it's a much smaller audience. So I'm going to saturate and show that ad to every single person that's in my target demographic. We're going to run through that entire audience size, likely reserve a second time, reserve a third time, maybe a fourth time. And by that point, the probability of either a lead coming through or a conversion occurring on ecom after 2, 3, 4 impressions with an identical ad drops precipitously. And so the odds of a conversion after that many impressions on one unique ad is so low that that's where you actually see creative fatigue. And that is actually what creative fatigue is, which is that you're serving an ad to your target demographic, and the target demographic has now all seen the ad, or at least the people that will resonate with this creative and the message that's in it, they have all seen the ad. Now you're going to colder and colder audiences who are less likely to buy from this angle, and that's when you start to see the drop off in performance. Now, a really effective strategy if you're a smaller ecom brand is niching down, particularly when you're thinking through your angles and target demographics that you're going after. And we have a video on this, which is called the biggest problem that we see with sub $1 million brands. And that is that they don't have product market fit because they're going at very broad audiences. And the example that I had in that was that if you were to go and sell peppermint tea to just anyone that likes peppermint tea, it's going to be very difficult to actually cut through because they likely already have a brand that they go to. What are your value propositions going to be over that? Is there a price advantage? There's likely no advantage that you can get over the big competitors. So instead, you sell the exact same product, the peppermint tea, but you go after a very, very specific audience. Maybe it's males aged between 40 to 45 that are having issues with sleeping, and this particular tea can be angled in a way that it helps reduce sleep latency. And so because of that, you start launching incredibly specific ads and going after incredibly specific audiences, and they work very well. They work much better than your broad targeting and your broad messaging. However, because it's a very specific message at a very specific audience, you will fatigue that audience much faster. And so when you have incredibly specific ads within an ad account, and that's normally what I recommend building out, is that you have concepts. And so you have concept 1, which is contained within an ad set, and there's 3 to 5 ads that exist under this concept. You have ad set 2, and you have 3 to 5 ads that exist under here. Then you have concept 3. And so each of these concepts is going after a unique audience, not in terms of the actual physical targeting within the campaign. This could all be on broad targeting, but the actual ad design is messaging towards a very specific audience. So in the tea example, this might be males 40 to 45. This might be females buying for their partners. And this might be people that are just interested in the flavor of tea, as opposed to actually pulling out that value proposition of sleep latency. And then because of that, we can have diversity in messaging and hit multiple different target demographics to try to maximize the total spend that we can contain within the account. Now, the issue there is you have to really rapidly continue to launch concepts on an ongoing basis, because these will fatigue very quickly. So a strategy here to be able to build out a little bit more scalability in your approach to ad design is to every so often build in a concept or build in creatives that are incredibly broad. And so rather than going after a very specific pain point to a very specific target demographic, you go really broad. Now, this isn't going to work majority of the time. The hit rate on this is probably going to be similar, if not worse, to the account-wide hit rate. But when you do get an ad that works in here, it will be able to sustain much higher volumes of spend, and it will likely be one of the highest performing based on using spend as a proxy ad within the entire ad account's history. And so starting to introduce more broad targeting, and I don't mean like mechanically within the Facebook ad account of using broad targeting. I mean the actual ad design and the concept that you're going after, keeping it broad, going after a very wide target demographic is going to allow you to get more spend into the ad over a longer time horizon. Now, when it comes to tactics, there's a lot of different tactics that you can use to get more spend through an ad. And so as we saw earlier, and let's copy and paste this over, when you launch an ad, you end up having this ramp up period where you start putting more and more spend through it, you're increasing budgets, and then at a certain point you see diminishing returns, so you pull that back, and then you end up maintaining at that spend level until the ad fatigues. Now, there's always slight media buying hacks in which you can try to get incremental spend through one unique asset. And one of those ways is pulling the ad post ID out of an ABO, putting it in an Advantage Plus. That's likely going to go after slightly different audiences, which is going to allow you to sustain higher daily spend levels. Now, there is a solid argument that if you try to squeeze more incremental daily spend into an ad, you're just pulling from the ad spend back here. And so the total spend will always be the same over time. If you can manage to get more profitable spend now, all you're doing is stealing from the spend later. And I think that's a reasonable argument. The question then just becomes, what is the cost of capital for that time horizon? So do you want to realize this revenue now, or do you want to realize it in 2 months? And are you happy to have this creative fatigue faster, but be able to squeeze all of this into a graph that looks something like this? And obviously this depends on your inventory constraints and the decisions of the business and how quickly you'd like to scale. But this can generally be a better decision, considering that it will shorten your cash conversion cycle. And so tactics to do that is number 1, Advantage Plus. Number 2, and this still works a decent amount of the time, it's got about a 40% hit rate, which is duplication of ad sets. Number 3 is when you start to approach this section of creative fatiguing, taking the creative and going and putting it in a cost cap campaign with an incredibly high budget with a constrained cost cap on it generally allows you to get a little bit extra spend and squeeze this spend forward in time. And then number 4, which starts to branch outside of media buying and is more creative dependent, is slight iterations on the actual creative. And this comes in the form of changing the creative itself. So changing the hook, changing the messaging slightly, changing maybe the product image that's within the static. But it also comes within the copy, predominantly the headline, but also the primary text as well. If you can rotate in new primary text, new copy, and potentially this involves a change of the offer, this is a really good way to be able to push incremental spend through what was essentially the same creative, although it is going to have a unique ID. So just to recap, every single creative will fatigue eventually. There will be a point in which you won't be able to run an ad anymore. And what that graph ends up looking like is a sharp incline, as long as you're seeing performance, a slow decline, and then it will go to 0. You need to understand that you still need to maximize volume and look at increasing hit rates. But if you want to create an ad that's really scalable and it's going to hold more spend than any ad in the account, it needs to be relatively broad in terms of the angle and the concept, because creative fatigue is directly proportional to the size of the target audience. It's also proportional to the quality of the ad, obviously, but the size of the audience does matter. And then when you're looking at tactics and actually either changing what this curve looks like by shortening it, or just trying to get a little bit more incremental spend in here on the total ad, you can use Advantage Plus campaigns by pulling IDs. You can duplicate ABOs. You can use cost cap campaigns to try to squeeze more budget. And the most important one, in my opinion, is make iterations on the creative. So slight iterations on hooks, slight iterations on messaging, and also slight iterations on copy and the offer being used.